Corporal James Hale had lived through battles that would break most men. The war with the Yulari had eaten away years of his life, leaving scars on his body and deeper ones in his heart. He remembered the smell of burnt sand, the sound of plasma rifles tearing through armor, and the heavy silence after a comrade fell. War had become the only thing he knew. When the ceasefire was signed, James expected nothing more than transport back to Earth. He dreamed of the blue sky, of the ocean waves he hadn't seen in so long, of his mother's voice calling him home. But the reality was different. Humanity might have won, but victory had come with strange terms, and he was about to find out what that meant. The summons arrived on a piece of alien parchment, marked with glowing script that pulsed faintly like a heartbeat. 2 Yulari guards delivered it without a word. Their tall figures loomed in the doorway of his barracks, eyes unblinking, faces unreadable. James didn't resist. He followed, boots crunching on the stone floor, wondering what crime he was being accused of. Inside the court chamber, everything felt heavy with judgment. The air smelled faintly of incense and iron. At the far end, upon a throne carved from obsidian, sat the High Matron. She was taller than any human woman, with skin like liquid silver and eyes the color of midnight seas. Around her, other matrons sat in silence, their robes flowing like rivers of dark silk. James stood before them, his hands clenched, his jaw tight. He had faced enemy fire without flinching, but this was different. This was not the battlefield. This was a trial. The High Matron spoke, her voice echoing in the chamber, soft yet commanding. "Corporal James Hale of Earth, you have been brought before us not as a prisoner, but as one chosen by decree." James frowned. Chosen? He expected them to accuse him of war crimes, of killing their soldiers, of leading raids. He braced for anger, for condemnation, but the words that followed pierced him deeper than any blade. "Your strength has been proven. Your bloodline is fierce and enduring. The Yulari Empire has suffered greatly. Our sons are gone, our warriors fallen. Our daughters reach maturity with no one left to give them children. Therefore, by law of the High Court, you are ordered to mate with our newly adult females. Your seed will carry into the future what war has stolen from us." The chamber fell silent. James blinked, certain he had misheard. He wanted to laugh, but no sound came out. His heart hammered in his chest. They wanted what? He felt the weight of every battle, every death pressing down on him. Was this their idea of justice? To turn him into breeding stock? His voice was rough, edged with disbelief. "You want me to mate with them? After everything? After your soldiers slaughtered my brothers? After your fire rained down on our cities?" The High Matron's eyes did not waver. "Yes, because you survived when many did not. Because your humanity, brutal as it is, holds within it a power we cannot deny. You may see insult, but we see necessity." James's hands shook. He had faced death countless times, but this felt worse. This felt like they were stripping him of choice, of dignity. Anger burned in his chest, but when he looked past the throne, he noticed them, the daughters. They stood behind a curtain of silk, barely visible, watching. Their faces were young, frightened, unsure. They were not warriors. They were not killers. They were simply daughters born in the shadow of war, caught in a cycle they did not choose. Their eyes held no hatred for him, only fear of what tomorrow might bring. And in that moment, James understood something painful. This wasn't about punishment. It wasn't about revenge. It was about survival. Still, he could not accept it easily. His voice trembled with fury. "You think I'll just obey? You think I'll forget what your kind did to us? To me?" The High Matron leaned forward, silver hair glinting in the dim light. "You misunderstand, human. This is not for us. It is for them. Without new life, our kind dies. You may refuse, but if you do, you will condemn them to nothingness." The word struck him like a blow. He felt the war ghosts stirring inside him. His fallen squad mates, the ashes of Earth's cities, the rivers of blood spilled on both sides. He wanted to hate them. He wanted to walk away. But when he looked at those daughters again, at their trembling hands and uncertain faces, his anger cracked. For the first time in years, James Hale did not know what to do. He had been ordered to kill. Now he was being ordered to save. James Hale could not sleep that night. The words of the High Matron circled in his head like vultures over a battlefield. "You are ordered to mate with our newly adult females." It sounded less like a decree and more like a chain around his neck. He had been a soldier all his life, trained to follow orders. But this was not duty. This was something that clawed at his humanity. To them, it seemed simple: biology, survival, the continuation of their species. But to him, it was unbearable. It wasn't love. It wasn't choice. It was being turned into a tool again, just a different kind of weapon. James sat on the stone bench in the quarters they gave him, staring at his hands. Hands that had fired rifles, thrown grenades, dragged bleeding men to safety. He thought about Daniels, the young private who had taken a plasma bolt through the chest and died coughing blood in James's arms. He thought about Ortega, who had burned alive in a trench because the medics couldn't reach him in time. Those men had fought beside him, laughed with him, shared rations with him. And now their blood demanded justice. But the Yulari were not asking for justice. They were asking for mercy. James hated them for that. He hated them for forcing this choice on him, for daring to ask him to give what he had left of his soul. And yet, he could not ignore what he had seen in the court. The daughters. They weren't soldiers. They weren't killers. They were young women standing in silk robes, frightened and uncertain. They hadn't pulled triggers. They hadn't marched into human cities with fire in their hands. They were born into a war they never asked for, and now they stood on the edge of extinction. That thought dug into James's chest like a blade. When dawn came, the guards led him to another chamber, smaller, quieter. The high matron was not there this time. Instead, another figure waited for him, a Yulari elder, her silver hair tied in braids, her face lined with the weight of centuries. She introduced herself simply as Lysera. "You are troubled," she said, her voice calm, almost gentle. James didn't answer at first. He looked at her, trying to see the enemy in her face, but all he saw was exhaustion. Finally, he muttered, "You think I'll just accept this? You think I'll forget what your kind did?" Lysera nodded slowly as if she expected the words. "No, we do not expect you to forget. We know what we have taken from your people. I know you carry ghosts in your heart." She stepped closer, lowering her voice. "But the daughters carry no ghosts, only fear. Do not punish them for our sins." James clenched his fists. The truth in her words cut deeper than he wanted to admit. He wanted to hold on to his anger. It was the only thing that had kept him alive for so long. But anger couldn't bring back Daniels. It couldn't bring back Ortega. It couldn't bring back anyone. Still, he wasn't ready to give in. His voice was sharp when he asked, "And what if I refuse? What happens then?" Lysera's eyes fell, and for the first time James saw sorrow on her alien face. "Then our daughters will wither. Our line will end, and your name will be remembered among us as the one who chose death for a people who had no more strength to fight." The words hit him like artillery. He wasn't just choosing for himself, he was choosing life or death for an entire generation. That kind of burden wasn't fair. It wasn't human, and yet it was on his shoulders now. When the guards finally escorted him back to his quarters, James sat in silence, his mind tearing itself apart. On one hand, he saw the graves of his comrades, the ashes of Earth's cities, the blood that screamed for vengeance. On the other hand, he saw the trembling faces of the Yulari daughters, eyes wide with fear, waiting for someone, anyone, to give them a chance at tomorrow. It wasn't fair. None of it was fair. But war had never been fair. James Hale pressed his palms against his face, fighting back the weight pressing down on his chest. He didn't know what he would decide, but he knew one thing. Whatever choice he made, it would haunt him forever. And in the silence of that alien night, one truth settled in his heart like a stone. This was not about obedience. This was not about orders. This was about what kind of man he was willing to become. That night, James Hale dreamed. The battlefield rose in his mind like a storm he could never escape. He saw the red sands of Kethra stretching endlessly, littered with broken helmets and shattered rifles. The sky burned with the glow of plasma fire, and the air smelled of iron and smoke. He saw Daniels again, the youngest of his squad. Barely 20, with freckles on his nose and a laugh that used to lighten even the darkest trenches. Daniels had been shot through the chest, his blood pumping into the sand while James held him, whispering, "Stay with me, kid. Just stay." But the light had left Daniel's eyes before medics could arrive. Then came Ortega. Brave Ortega, who always carried a photo of his wife in his pocket. The Yulari bombardment had turned their position into a furnace, and James still heard his screams echoing in his ears. When the fire had died, there had been nothing left but blackened armor and silence. The dream shifted. James was running through ruined cities on Earth, the shadows of Yulari warships blotting out the sun. He saw civilians crushed beneath collapsing towers, mothers clutching their children, flame-swallowing streets he once knew. The cries of the dying mixed with the roars of alien weapons, and James felt helpless all over again. He woke with a gasp, sweat dripping down his face, heart pounding like a drum. His hands trembled as if they still clutched his rifle. For a moment he forgot where he was. He expected to hear the crackle of radio static, the orders shouted over comms, the endless call to fire. But instead there was silence. Alien silence. James pressed his palms against his eyes. The ghosts of war would never leave him. They had carved themselves into his soul, and now the Yulari wanted him to build something new from those same scars. He stood and walked to the small window in his chamber. Outside, the alien city glowed faintly under twin moons. The streets were quiet. For the first time, he noticed families walking in the distance, mothers carrying children, elders speaking softly, daughters laughing in whispers. Not soldiers, not killers, just people trying to survive after losing too much. It struck him like lightning. He had spent years seeing the Yulari as monsters, but the truth was more complicated. Monsters had tried to kill him, yes, but there were also innocents caught in the same storm. Civilians who hadn't fired weapons. Young ones who had no choice in the war. Mothers who wept the same way human mothers did when sons didn't come home. James's throat tightened. He had hated them for so long. It was the only way to keep fighting. But now, staring at the quiet life of their city, he felt something he hadn't expected. Pity. When the dawn came, a Yulari attendant entered his chamber with food. She was older, her silver hair tied neatly, her hands steady. She set the tray down without looking at him. But before she left, she paused, as if gathering courage, and whispered, "My son died in the war. Your guns took him from me. I hated humans. I prayed for your destruction. But now," she looked at him with eyes full of tears, "now I pray you will give my people life again. I pray you will not let our daughters vanish." The door closed behind her, and James sat in silence, staring at the untouched food. His chest felt heavy, not with anger this time, but with something else. He remembered Daniels, Ortega, the countless others. They had died to protect humanity, to give the next generation a chance. Wasn't that the same thing the Yulari were asking of him now? It was twisted. It was unfair. It was cruel. But maybe survival was never clean. James lay back down, eyes staring at the ceiling. His mind was torn in two. On one side were the ghosts screaming for vengeance. On the other side were the living, begging for mercy. For hours he lay there, listening to the silence of the alien city. And finally, in the quiet of his own heart, he whispered words he had never thought he would say. They deserve to live too. The summons came again the next morning, though softer this time. No armed guards. No threats. Only a young attendant who bowed politely and said, "The daughters wish to meet you." James Hale felt his chest tighten. He had faced artillery fire without fear, but the thought of walking into that chamber made his stomach twist. He wasn't ready. He wasn't sure he would ever be ready. Still he followed. A soldier's habit, when called, you go. The chamber was nothing like the courtroom of the High Matron. This one was smaller, warmer. The walls were draped with fabric in soft colors, and faint lights glowed like stars overhead. It didn't feel like a place of judgment. It felt like a place of waiting, and they were waiting. The daughters stood in a line, dressed in flowing robes of pale silver and blue. There were 5 of them, all newly adult by Yulari tradition. Their eyes were wide and uncertain as they looked at him, the human soldier who had once been their enemy. Some clutched their hands together nervously. Others looked down at the floor, unable to meet his gaze. James froze at the doorway. They looked so young. Not in years, perhaps, but in spirit. They were untouched by war, their faces unscarred by battle, their hands soft. They reminded him of the girls back home, the ones who had waited tables, walked along beaches, laughed in summer nights before the war had stolen everything. One of the daughters stepped forward. She was taller than the rest, her silver skin catching the light, but her voice trembled when she spoke. "We were told you hate us." The words cut through the silence like a knife. James opened his mouth, then closed it again. Hate. Did he hate them? He had hated their soldiers, their generals, their warships. He had hated the endless death they brought. But these young women? He didn't even know them. Finally, he answered in a rough voice, "I did, maybe I still do, but I hate Graves more." The daughters looked at one another, confused. One of the younger ones whispered, "What does that mean?" James took a slow step forward, his boots echoing on the stone floor. His eyes moved across their faces one by one. "It means I've buried too many. My friends. My brothers. Men I would have died for. And I've seen your kind bury theirs too. War leaves nothing behind but graves. I don't want more of them. Not for my people. Not for yours." The tallest daughter lowered her gaze. The room grew quiet again, heavy with unspoken thoughts. Finally, the youngest, a girl with bright silver eyes, whispered almost too softly to hear, "Then, you'll help us?" James felt his chest ache. The hope in her voice was fragile, like glass that could shatter with a single wrong word. He swallowed hard, forcing the words out. "I'll try, but not as your enemy. If I stand with you, it won't be as a weapon. It'll be as your protector." The daughters exchanged glances. Their shoulders eased, their hands relaxed. The fear in their eyes shifted, replaced by something else, something James hadn't seen in a long time. Trust. He didn't deserve it. Not yet, but it was there. The eldest daughter stepped closer, her voice steadier now. "Our people see you as a symbol. Some fear you, some despise you, but we only see a man who could give us a chance. We don't ask for obedience, only that you do not turn away from us." James nodded slowly. He wasn't sure what he was promising. He wasn't sure if he had the strength to give them what they needed. But in that moment, looking at their faces, he knew he couldn't walk away. He had been ordered to kill. He had been ordered to survive. Now he was being asked to help life grow where war had destroyed. It was the strangest mission he had ever faced. As the meeting ended, the daughters bowed their heads in unison. The youngest one lingered, her eyes locked on his. "Thank you," she whispered. James turned away before they could see the emotion rising in his eyes. For the first time since the war began, he felt something stronger than anger or grief. He felt the faintest spark of hope. For a short time, things seemed calmer. James Hale visited the daughters more often. He listened to their questions, told them simple stories about Earth, and slowly began to see them less as strangers and more as fragile lives in need of protection. But peace was never meant to last. Not everyone welcomed him. Among the Yulari, many still hated humanity. Old generals, scarred veterans, and grieving mothers whispered in the streets. They looked at James with burning eyes. To them, he was not a savior, but a reminder of their defeat. He was the soldier who carried human blood, the same blood that had killed their sons and burned their cities. One evening, James walked through the market square under the twin moons. He felt the weight of eyes on him. Whispers followed him like shadows. "Defiler!" one voice hissed. "Animal," muttered another. He ignored them, but his fists clenched at his sides. When he returned to his quarters, he found a message scratched into the wall with a blade. The words were jagged and deep, "Leave or die." James stared at it for a long time. He wasn't afraid for himself. He had faced worse threats in battle. But he thought of the daughters. If his presence brought danger, would they suffer too? That thought ate at him. The next day, the answer came. Night had fallen, and James was half asleep when the sound of metal scraping woke him. He sat up instantly, instincts from war snapping awake. The door creaked, and shadows moved inside. Figures slipped into the room, 3 of them cloaked and armed with curved blades that glimmered faintly. Assassins. James moved fast. He grabbed the edge of the wooden table and shoved it into the first attacker, sending him sprawling. The second lunged, blade flashing, but James caught his wrist, twisting until the bone cracked and the weapon fell. Pain shot through James's side as the third slashed, cutting deep into his ribs. But he had felt worse in battle. He roared and slammed his fist into the attacker's jaw, dropping him instantly. The fight was brutal and short. When it was over, the floor was stained with blood and James's breath came in ragged gasps. His side burned, but he was alive. The assassins lay unconscious or groaning in pain. Before he could catch his breath, the daughters rushed in, their faces pale with terror. The youngest cried out when she saw the wound on his side. "You're hurt," she sobbed, reaching for him. James shook his head, forcing a grin through clenched teeth. "It's nothing. I've had worse." but his knees buckled and he sank against the wall. The eldest daughter knelt beside him, pressing her hand firmly over the wound to slow the bleeding. Her silver eyes blazed with fury. "They did this because of us," she whispered. "Because you chose to stand with us." James looked at her, then at the others hovering behind her, their faces filled with fear. In that moment, he understood something. This wasn't just about survival anymore. It wasn't just about bloodlines or duty. It was about loyalty. His voice was rough but steady. "Listen to me. If I do this, if I stay with you, then I'm part of your people now. And I protect what's mine." The words seemed to echo in the room heavier than any oath. The daughters stared at him, their fear melting into something stronger. Trust. Hope. Later, when healers arrived to treat his wound and guards dragged away the assassins, James lay in silence, staring at the ceiling. The pain in his ribs was sharp, but it was nothing compared to the fire burning in his chest. He wasn't just surviving anymore. He wasn't just obeying. He had made a choice, and he knew, deep in his heart, that choice would put him at war again. Not against humanity this time, but against those who wanted to see him and the daughters destroyed. The ghosts of the past had followed him here. But now he wasn't fighting for revenge. He was fighting for tomorrow. James Hale healed slowly. The wound on his side burned for days, each movement reminding him of the night assassins tried to take his life. But what stayed with him more than the pain was the memory of the daughters' faces when they rushed to his side. Fear. Worry. Care. He had not expected that from them. At first, he stayed in his quarters recovering. The daughters visited often, bringing food and herbs, sometimes sitting quietly beside him as he rested. They did not ask questions about the attack. They did not ask why he chose to fight for them. They only stayed as if their presence alone was enough. And somehow it was. As days turned into weeks, James began to move again. His steps were slower, his strength not yet returned, but he found himself walking the gardens with the daughters. The gardens were unlike anything on earth. Trees with silver leaves shimmered in the light of the twin suns. Flowers glowed faintly in the dark, releasing soft fragrances that calmed his heart. It was in those gardens that the daughters began to speak more freely. They asked him about Earth. "What is it like?" one asked, her voice curious. "We hear it has oceans that never end." James smiled faintly. "It does. Water as far as the eye can see. Waves that crash and roar, and beaches where children run barefoot." The youngest daughter's eyes widened with wonder. "It sounds like a dream." He laughed softly. "It felt that way sometimes. I used to sit by the shore when I was a boy. The ocean made you feel small but safe, like the world was bigger than your problems." Another daughter leaned closer. "And music? We have songs, but our elders say human music is different." James's chest tightened at the memory. He could still hear Daniel strumming a guitar in the barracks, singing off-key but smiling anyway. "Music is life," he said quietly. "It carries joy, sorrow, hope. Sometimes it's the only thing that keeps you going." The daughters listened in silence, their silver eyes soft. For the first time, James saw them not as strangers or symbols, but as young women curious about the world, desperate for stories of a future they might never see. In return, they told him about their people. They spoke of sky cities that once floated among the clouds, now fallen to ruin. They spoke of gardens that stretched for miles, now reduced to ash by war. Their voices trembled when they spoke of brothers lost, fathers gone, families broken. James listened. He didn't interrupt. He simply listened, and with every word he realized their grief was not so different from his own. One evening, as the twin moons rose above the horizon, the eldest daughter looked at him and asked the question that had been hanging in the air for weeks. "Do you regret staying?" James paused. He thought of Daniel's, Ortega, the graves of men he loved like brothers. He thought of the assassins, of the threats carved into his walls. Then he thought of the daughters, their trembling hands, their voices filled with fragile hope, their laughter in the garden. "No," he said finally, "not anymore." The daughters exchanged glances, their faces softening. The youngest reached out, her small hand brushing against his scarred one. "Then we are not afraid anymore." Something shifted in James's chest at those words. It was not love, not yet. It was not forgiveness for the war or the blood spilled, but it was connection. It was the first brick in a bridge that might one day hold two worlds together. Days turned into months. James grew stronger. The daughters grew braver. They laughed more, asked more questions, dreamed louder. And James found himself telling stories he had buried deep, stories of childhood, of family, of hope. Each word healed him a little more. The court still watched him with suspicion. The whispers in the streets had not gone silent, but in the gardens, in the quiet chambers, James no longer felt like an enemy or a prisoner. He felt like something else. The daughters no longer called him human soldier. They had given him a new name, spoken softly among themselves when they thought he couldn't hear, Father of Tomorrow. And though James never said it aloud, the name settled in his heart with a weight both heavy and holy. For the first time since the war began, James Hale began to believe he was more than a survivor. He was part of something greater, something worth protecting with everything he had left. Years passed, and time softened the wounds of war. James Hale stayed among the Yulari, not as a prisoner, not as a tool, but as a bridge between two broken worlds. The daughters grew into women, and from their union with him came children, half human, half Yulari. They were different, stronger than either parent alone, with the endurance of humanity and the grace of the Yulari. Their laughter filled the courtyards, their footsteps echoed through the gardens, and their voices carried like music under the twin moons. Where once there had been silence and despair, now there was life. The city began to change. At first, whispers followed the children everywhere. Half-bloods, some spat. Abominations, muttered others. But over time, the whispers faded. For how could anyone hate what brought joy? How could anyone deny the sparkle in a child's eyes or the hope in a mother's smile? Slowly, even the hardest hearts softened. James walked among them, scarred but proud. The ghosts of war still lived inside him. He never forgot Daniels, Ortega, and the countless others. But for the first time, their memory did not tear him apart. Instead, he felt as if they walked beside him, watching the future he had fought to protect. But life was never without struggle. There were still those who despised him, still generals who whispered that the human should never have been allowed to stay. Some even tried again to strike against him, but each attempt failed, for James was no longer alone. The daughters stood with him. The children stood with him. And many Yulari, once unsure, now saw him as part of their people. One evening, years later, James sat in the garden with the eldest daughter. Their children played nearby, chasing each other beneath the silver trees. She looked at him quietly for a long time before speaking. "You came to us as an enemy," she said softly. "Do you regret it now?" James's eyes followed the children, his voice steady but thick with emotion. "No, if anything, this is the only fight I've ever won that mattered." Her hand brushed his. For a moment, neither spoke. The sound of laughter filled the night, and James let himself smile. But time was cruel. His body, once hardened by battle, began to weaken. Scars ached more than they once did, and his strength slowly left him. Humanity and Yulari aged differently, and though the daughters remained youthful, James grew older. His hair turned gray, his steps slowed, his hands trembled. The children noticed first. They asked why their father tired so easily, why he needed rest when they still wanted to play. James only smiled and told them, "Every warrior must lay down his sword someday." And when his final day came, the whole city fell silent. The daughters gathered at his side, their hands clasped around his. The children wept softly, clinging to him, refusing to let go. James's breaths were shallow, but his eyes were clear. He looked at the faces around him, the family he had never expected to have, the people he had once called enemies but now called his own. "I came here ready to die," he whispered. "Instead, you gave me a reason to live." Tears fell freely from Yulari eyes, silver against their cheeks. The youngest daughter bent close, her voice breaking. "We will carry you with us always." James Hale gave one last smile, small but full of peace. "Then my fight was worth it." His eyes closed, and the soldier who had survived the worst of war finally found rest. They buried him beneath the silver trees of the garden, where children laughed and played. The High Matron herself came to the ceremony, her voice carrying across the crowd. "He came to us as an enemy. He left his family. Humanity showed us war, but one human showed us mercy, and in mercy we found survival." Generations later, his story was still told. Children with human blood and Yulari grace carried his legacy across two worlds. They called him many names: warrior, savior, protector. But the one that remained strongest, whispered with love and reverence, was the name the daughters had given him long ago: Father of Tomorrow. And across both earth and Yulari skies, the truth of James Hale lived on. Humanity was not strongest in battle. Humanity was strongest in compassion.